Hello, my name is Joe Cartwright and welcome to my studio. Today we're going to be looking at brush and paint control when creating a watercolor painting. This is a critical skill every watercolorist wrestles with at some stage in their career. I've designed this simple seascape specifically to help you master these essential techniques. We'll look at how to manage your washes so you don't end up with any muddy effects, and I'll show you how to use a dry brush stroke to create beautiful foam at the edge of a sea or when creating clouds or tree foliage. I will also cover why it's important to always be aware of the moisture content on the surface of your paper and in your brush. My goal is to make these steps easy to understand so you can have a bit of fun with your painting. So go grab your brushes and let's get started. Once your drawing's done, the first step is to wet the back. While that's absorbing all the water, I'll mix some colours. We've got some cobalt blue for the sky, some raw umber for the sand, and that'll get us started. I'm keeping this painting fairly simple because my main focus is to teach you the key steps to keep in mind when painting a landscape or a seascape like this. So that's the sky. And some raw umber. And that'll get us started. You can see how the paper is still buckled here, so that says it can absorb more water. So let me wet it some more. And I'll wet the board. Now we've got some clouds coming in from the right hand side. They help direct the eye into the focal point, which is this part of the painting. So to do that, pick up my brush, and the brush is almost parallel to the paper when I do this, and quick strokes just to create the edge of the clouds. Don't worry about this part here, I'm going to fill a lot of that in a minute. I'm going to create another section of cloud here. And then that will be very weak at the water's edge. See how I'm holding the brush? Holding it this way allows me to create that distant horizon line very easily. Now I'm going to clean my brush. I probably removed about 95% of the paint. Throw in another little cloud here. The main thing is not to lose all the white hard edges in the clouds when I do this. Now, I'd like this to be a bit stronger in tone. So I'm going to mix some more cobalt blue. Because the surface of the paper is still very wet, I don't risk creating any sort of muddy effects. Make this a little bit stronger. So the first step, which we've already started, is to paint the big shapes. So the biggest shapes are going to be the sky and the sand. At the same time, we're painting from darker tones to lighter tones. So darker tones are closer to us, lighter tones are further away. So this is the sky above our head, this is the sky way in the horizon. Now for the sand, I've got some raw umber here. I'm going to also get a little bit of raw sienna because there's a nice warm patch underneath the hill. Then I'll go into the raw umber. And to create this impression of foam at the water's edge, I'm using a very quick brush stroke called a dry brush stroke. I'm not trying to put everything that's in the reference in my painting. I'm just trying to capture the atmosphere of this scene. Now this area here needs to be lighter. So I'll just use a thirsty brush to lift some of that. Because again, we're going to have lighter tones in the distance and stronger tones in the foreground. As long as we're talking about similar things, so the sand in the distance will be lighter in tone than the sand in the foreground. So to strengthen the tone in the foreground, I'm adding more raw umber, no more water, and I've also warmed it up with a little bit of burnt sienna, because the other thing that happens with a scene like this is similar objects in the distance will be cooler than the ones in the foreground. So I'm adding a little bit of burnt sienna to warm this up. And I'm going to soften some of this area here. And later when I paint the water, this will allow me to create a more interesting transition from the wet sand into the water itself. And I'm going to darken this a little bit more. So I'll get a smaller brush, size 8. Add a hint of French ultramarine into it. And that will just add a little bit more detail in the foreground, because as objects move closer to you, you'll start seeing more and more detail, whereas if they're in the distance, you see less detail. All right, while that's drying, I'm going to mix the colours for the trees, the hill, and the rocks. This is where I'll mix the core rock colour. Here, a little bit of the green on the rocks. And here I'll mix some colour for the trees. Because of the lighting in this scene and due to the time of the day that I took the photo, other than the little bit of green on the rocks, most of the foliage is in silhouette, so you're not going to see a lot of green in these trees. So my main colours are French ultramarine and raw umber. This Winsor & Newton raw umber is a yellowish raw umber, so that when it mixes with the French ultramarine, it gives me a very dull green, as you can see here. I'm going to add a small amount of aureolin. You can use lemon yellow. Any cool green leaning yellow would work just as well. That'll do. Leave that there. And then for the rocks, lots of burnt sienna and lots of French ultramarine. Notice how I'm testing the colours on my paper before I touch the paper. I've got plenty of time because this is still drying. And I want a hint of the brown coming through. I don't want a black. Pure black looks very unnatural in a painting. And then for the bright green, of which I don't need anywhere near as much as that, so let me get rid of most of that water. For that we'll use mainly the aureolin and some cobalt turquoise. And that gives us a very lovely bright green. Okay, this is just barely damp. I'm going to very quickly just hit this area with a hairdryer. My aim is just to dry the very top layer of the paper, not the wet paper underneath. I can use this rock colour for the foliage, but I'll just modify it with a little bit of this green. And I'm going to start with a rigger and paint in some of the tree branches and trunks. don't need to put a lot of these in because most of it is going to be covered with foliage very soon. And I can throw in a little bit more detail later if I think I need to. Pick up this dull green colour. Similar to how I painted the clouds here using a pushing action, and notice how the tip of my brush is not touching the paper. That could be a little bit stronger, so I'm going to add more paint. Again, just raw umber and French ultramarine will do. When you're painting, the time to make adjustments is as soon as you start painting. As soon as you see that a colour might not be strong enough, don't keep painting the rest thinking you're going to come back and fix it later, because it's always easier to fix at the time. That brush is a little bit too small. So when you're painting a scene like this, you generally, when you're painting your big shapes, you can use your bigger brushes, and then as you start painting more detail, you move to smaller and smaller brushes. So when I was painting the fine detail for the branches and trunks here, I went to a small brush, which is my rigger. This is a relatively big shape, so I need to use a bigger brush. If you use too small a brush for the big shapes, you find you can start fiddling too much. It's important to keep some of these little bird holes or gaps within the foliage. I went in with more paint there than I wanted to, so while that's still quite wet, I can lift most of that. I like to paint my branches and trunks while the foliage paint is still wet. That gives you a much better connection between the foliage and the branches. So I'm going to mix some of this bright green and dull green and just adjust some of the colours in the foliage. Just so it's not one flat colour. Because this paint's not flowing as much as I'd like, I'm going to give it a very light spray. That re-establishes the shine on the paper. And now you can see how that paint is flowing and creating more natural curves and shapes within the foliage. All right, let's move on to the rocks now. We've got some nice bright green colours here. And a little bit up here. Just a hint there. Here I'm just establishing the core shapes of these rocks. And I'll adjust the colour, adding more blue to it, a little bit more burnt sienna. This also gives me a stronger tone. I can use that to throw in some of the darker areas in these rocks. Again, I'm not trying to throw in every little rock and crevice, just want to capture the feel of this scene. Get my size 8 brush again. Just mix some of these greens in this dark colour, and I'm going to just splatter some paint into the grass areas. In fact, I'll even splatter some up here. That'll just make these trees look a bit more interesting. I was a bit sloppy with the splatter there. Now I'm going to get my smaller brush, and we've got all this foam at the edge of the rock. So what I'm going to do for that, again using a similar dry brush technique to what I use for the foliage and these trees, and just very lightly create a dry brush effect at the bottom of the rocks, and that will read like foam once I do the water. It's best to have more of that foam there now, because when we paint the water, we'll paint into it and we'll lose some of that effect. And because these are small shapes, I'm now moving to small brushes. So big shapes, big brushes, small shapes and detail, a smaller brush. And remember, you can always remove some of these light foam areas, but it's a lot harder to retrieve them. Going to use some of the same colour, just a hint at a shadow at the edge of the cliff. And that breaks up that edge and makes it look a little bit more interesting. Dropping in some darker crevices. Again, I'm doing this while there's plenty of shine on the paper, so the paint will still flow a little bit. Okay, this is moving along well. I just like a little bit more texture on some of these rocks, so I'll just get an old membership card and use that to scrape out some texture and some highlights. And because I'm doing this while this is wet, some of that paint will flow back in and create a nice little effect. I'll put a highlight on this tree trunk. Now I'm going to get a brush, big brush, plenty of water in it, and I'm going to drizzle this water over the rock area. And the water is helping me paint this scene, break up some of these sharper edges. There we go. The foliage tones were too light relative to the darker tones in the rocks, so that's why I've gone in and just darken them a little bit, and that way the foliage will connect better to these rocks here. And can you see how now that water flowing down the paper has given us this lovely natural looking effect on these rocks? I'm going to lift some of this excess paint. Now for the water, I use French ultramarine, with a tiny bit of burnt sienna, which will just grey it off a little bit. When you get to this stage, the colours in your painting are more important than the colours in the reference, especially if you've modified the sky. So in my case, I've added more blue in the sky than is in the reference. So I have to allow for that when I'm painting the water. Just start by establishing that horizon line. If your rocks are too wet, by all means dry them before you start doing this stage. I don't mind if a little bit of rock colour bleeds into the water. Again, quick dry brush strokes. Go in with some stronger paint to create undulations in the water. Pushing the brush. We have a lot of foam here and I want to try and capture that in my painting. Take some water out of my brush. There's a lot more foam here. Don't be scared to leave white paper. Now, as we get into the wet area of the sand, the colour of the water will be modified by the colour of the sand and also the reflection of the sky. So for that I need to clean part of my palette. And I'll add some burnt sienna to that mix. I've taken out just about all the paint from the brush for this stage. And you see how I dragged the brush through the paint that was pooling at the bottom of the rocks, and that helps give the impression of reflections of those rocks. Now these rocks that are in the water will have a little reflection. Same with these. You won't always see it. And some of this wet sand here, because it's reflecting the rocks, is actually quite dark. So for that, I'll get some of this colour. Here we'll be reflecting some of those rocks there. Because it's in quite wet sand, you won't see a strong reflection. Clean my brush, and then I'll just soften some of these edges and lift little highlights. Now, because I'm dealing with smaller and smaller shapes, by rights I should be using a small brush, but what you can also do, because I want to darken this shape, it's quite a small shape, I could get my size 8 brush, but if I've already got my size 12 in my hand, I just make sure I don't have a lot of paint in the brush. One of the good things about using a bigger brush for small shapes is it stops you from fiddling. Turn some of these highlights into rocks. Just adding hints of seaweed and something in the foreground. So all of these shapes help to bring this part of the painting forward. So remember, as things come forward, they have more detail in them than in the distance. Now that this has dried a bit more, I can go in, paint some of these darker trunks. Sometimes you can use the side of your rigger to create some interesting textures as well. Back to a small brush for some birds in the sky. Make sure your birds are different sizes and shapes. The smaller shapes will appear to be further away, so your bigger shapes will look like they're coming forward. Just adding a little shadow underneath some of this foam. And I'm going to leave it at that. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give it a like, and if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please do so. And if you're able, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I look forward to seeing you for the next one.